The regime's crackdown on Metropolis's lower district was already in its third hour when the situation stopped making sense to everyone involved. 6 regime enforcers, metahumans who had been hand-selected by Superman himself for their ability to handle the kind of resistance that normal soldiers couldn't, had cornered a group of insurgency sympathizers in the shell of a collapsed parking structure, and the operation was proceeding with the blunt, efficient violence that regime operations always proceeded with when the outcome was never genuinely in doubt. The enforcers were not being cruel about it, in the specific way that the regime had trained itself to frame the application of overwhelming force as something other than cruelty. They were maintaining order. They were protecting the stability that Superman had decided the world required, and the people on the other end of the operation were by definition disruptions to that stability and were being treated accordingly. Then something landed in the middle of the operation from above, cracking the concrete in a 2-meter radius and sending a fine dust cloud rolling outward across the debris field. And when the dust settled, there was a short man in a yellow suit standing between the enforcers and their targets, looking around at the situation with the mildly curious expression of someone who has just walked into the wrong meeting. Nobody had called him. Nobody knew who he was. And the regime's lead enforcer, a metahuman who had fought Kryptonians and survived, looked at this unremarkable figure and felt, for the first time in years, that the situation had produced something he had no category for. This was only the beginning, and the injustice world was completely unprepared for what it had just let arrive. If what you just heard didn't already tell you this story is different from anything you've seen before, the next 12 parts will. Subscribe now, because what happens when a world built on absolute power meets someone who simply doesn't care about power is not something you want to miss mid-story. The collapsed parking structure in Metropolis's lower district had been a landmark of the pre-regime era, one of those ordinary urban fixtures that nobody noticed when it was functional and everyone used as a reference point after it stopped being functional. And it had stopped being functional during the early consolidation period, when a confrontation between insurgency operatives and regime enforcers had brought down 3 of its 4 load-bearing walls in the span of about 90 seconds. What remained was a useful shell of partial cover and unstable debris that both sides had been using intermittently for months, which was the specific kind of tactical reuse that happens in cities where the war is ongoing, but neither side has the resources or the mandate to fully clear the contested spaces. The regime enforcers who had cornered the insurgency sympathizers in the structure's eastern section that afternoon had been doing so with the focused, professional efficiency of people who had run this kind of operation many times and knew exactly how it ended, which was with the targets either in regime custody or not in a condition to be in custody. And the outcome was close enough to certain that the lead enforcer had already been composing his after-action report in the back of his mind, while the operation was still technically in progress. The impact arrived without warning, which was the first thing wrong with it, because the regime's sensor net over Metropolis was comprehensive enough that aerial approaches were detected well before they arrived, and the lead enforcer's tactical display had been clear for the entire duration of the operation. The display had not flagged anything. There had been no heat signature, no velocity trail, no displacement event of any kind that the sensor architecture was designed to catch. And then the concrete cracked in a 2-meter radius at the center of the operational zone, and a fine dust cloud rolled outward, and a short man in a yellow suit was standing in the middle of it, looking around at the situation with the methodical, unhurried attention of someone taking stock of an unfamiliar environment. He was not in combat posture. He was not armed in any visible way. He was wearing a white cape that had collected dust from the impact, and which he briefly brushed at with one gloved hand before apparently deciding the effort wasn't worth it and returning his attention to his surroundings. The lead enforcer's name was Marcus Vale, and he had been selected for regime enforcement operations because his particular metahuman ability, the generation and directional projection of concussive force fields, made him effective against both armored opponents and large groups simultaneously, and because he had the specific psychological profile that the regime's screening process favored in its ground-level operatives. Decisive, compliant with authority, and possessed of the capacity to compartmentalize the moral weight of what he was doing into a space that didn't interfere with his professional function. He looked at the figure in the yellow suit and processed the landing, which had cracked reinforced concrete that was rated for vehicle weight, and his professional assessment updated from nuisance interruption to potential threat in the time it took him to fully register what the cracked concrete implied about the force of the impact. He signaled his team to hold position and stepped forward himself, because stepping forward himself was the appropriate response to an unknown metahuman of potentially significant capability, and he had enough experience to know that the first few seconds of an encounter with an unknown were the most information-rich seconds available. "This is a secured operation zone," he said, in the tone that regime enforcers used for warnings that were also, implicitly, final warnings. "Identify yourself and state your authorization to be in this area." Saitama looked at him. He looked at the 5 other enforcers fanned out behind Marcus. He looked at the group of people huddled behind the partial wall to his left, who were looking at him with the wide-eyed, uncomprehending attention of people who had just watched their situation change in a way they hadn't expected and weren't sure yet whether the change was good or bad. He looked back at Marcus and processed the question with the visible effort of someone translating from a language they only partially understand. "I was looking for a grocery store," he said. "Is this not that?" Marcus stared at him for one full second. "What?" he said, and it was not a question so much as a sound his mouth made while his brain was busy doing other things. "The one on the corner was closed," Saitama said, with the patient explanation of someone who has just realized the other person needs more context. "There was a sign. I think it said something about a curfew." He looked around at the debris and the partial walls and the people and the enforcers one more time. "Is this a different kind of store?" Marcus Vale's professional assessment had been updating continuously since the figure landed, and it had now reached a classification that his training had a category for, but which his experience had never actually encountered, which was the category of unknown entity whose behavior pattern does not correspond to any threat profile in the existing library. The concussive force field he deployed in response was not the full-power application he used against armored targets, but a significant directional burst designed to send an unarmored human being approximately 20 meters backward through whatever was behind them and leave them in a state that required medical attention before anything else was possible. It hit Saitama in the chest. Saitama looked down at where it had hit, then back up at Marcus, with the expression of someone who has just been flicked on the forehead by a stranger and is deciding whether this was intentional. "Was that you?" he asked. Marcus deployed the full-power application. The burst was the kind of force event that had previously caved in Insurgency vehicle armor and knocked Kryptonian-adjacent metahumans off their feet, and it hit Saitama at point-blank range and produced a crater in the concrete beneath his feet, where the overpressure had transferred into the ground because it had nowhere else to go. And Saitama remained standing in the center of the crater with his cape pushed slightly backward, and his expression upgraded from mildly confused to mildly annoyed. The specific annoyance of someone who has been interrupted several times while trying to accomplish a simple task. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the crater under his feet. He looked at Marcus again. "Okay," he said, with the quiet finality of someone who has decided that a situation needs to end so he can get on with his day. He reached out and tapped Marcus on the shoulder with 2 fingers, the most minimal contact available to him, and Marcus Vale went through the eastern wall of the parking structure, and the wall beyond that, and came to rest in the middle of what had been a sporting goods store across the street, alive and essentially intact in the sense that his bones had not failed structurally, but removed from the operational picture in every other sense. The 5 remaining enforcers looked at the hole in the wall, and looked at Saitama, and looked at the hole in the wall again. Saitama turned to the group of insurgency sympathizers behind the partial wall. "Is there a grocery store nearby?" he asked. One of them, a woman in her 40s who had been in the insurgency support network for 2 years and who had survived several regime operations, and who had thought she had a fairly comprehensive understanding of what the world now contained, pointed wordlessly to the left. "Thanks," Saitama said, and walked in that direction, stepping over the remaining enforcers' deployed equipment with the casual navigation of someone crossing a cluttered room, and was gone before anyone had found the words for what had just happened. The regime's sensor net registered Marcus Vale's emergency medical beacon, activating in the sporting goods store across the street at the same moment. It registered that the unknown entity that had triggered the beacon had vanished from its detection range entirely. Not because the entity had moved out of range, but because the sensor architecture had lost contact with it the same way it had failed to detect its arrival, completely and without explanation. In the regime's central monitoring station 3 kilometers away, an analyst stared at the gap in the sensor data, and then at the medical beacon, and then at the incident report beginning to compile itself from Marcus's team's emergency communications, and reached for his priority channel to the Hall of Justice, with the specific urgency of someone who has just realized that their job has become significantly more complicated. The Hall of Justice under Superman's regime was not the Hall of Justice that had existed before the world changed, in the same way that almost nothing in the world was the same as what it had been before the world changed. The building itself was structurally identical, the same grand architecture, the same scale designed to communicate something about the people who worked inside it, but the atmosphere inside it had undergone the specific transformation that happens to institutions when their founding purpose is replaced by a different purpose that uses the same language while meaning something fundamentally different. It had been built as a symbol of heroes who served the world. It now functioned as the operational headquarters of an authority structure that had decided it knew better than the world what the world needed. And the difference between those two things was visible in every interaction that happened within its walls, in the way people moved through it and spoke within it, and related to each other inside it, which was the way people move and speak and relate when the authority above them is absolute, and the consequences of insufficient deference are both real and immediate. Wonder Woman received the incident report from the Metropolis monitoring station within 4 minutes of Marcus Vale's medical beacon activating, which was within the standard response window for priority-flagged events in a regime-controlled zone, but was, in this case, 4 minutes longer than she would have preferred given the specific nature of what the report contained. She read it twice, which was not her standard practice for incident reports. She had developed over years of regime operations the ability to extract operationally relevant information from a report on a single pass and act on it without the delay of review. But this report required a second pass because the first pass produced conclusions that her framework for assessing field reports wasn't fully prepared to validate. An unknown entity had landed in the operational zone without sensor detection, had received a full-power concussive force deployment from a trained regime enforcer at point-blank range, had responded by removing that enforcer from the situation with what the remaining team's accounts described as a two-finger contact, and had then asked about a grocery store and walked away. The sensor data confirmed the landing impact. The crater under the entity's feet had been measured at a depth consistent with an object impacting from significant height at significant velocity, and the concrete was rated for vehicle weight. The sensor data also confirmed the complete absence of any detection signature before, during, or after the event. She set the report down and considered it for a moment, and then picked up the communication channel to the regime's intelligence division, because the intelligence division was the appropriate first stop for unknown entities, And because the alternative first stop was Superman, and bringing Superman a report of an unknown entity before the intelligence division had produced at least a preliminary profile was the kind of operational decision that had consequences she preferred to avoid. The intelligence division's preliminary analysis arrived 40 minutes later and contained, as its central finding, the information that the preliminary analysis was insufficient. They had cross-referenced every metahuman registry the regime maintained, every insurgency personnel file, every known enhanced individual database compiled since the early days of the consolidation, and the entity matched nothing. The physical parameters were the most problematic element. The landing impact, the force absorption, the concussive return force from the two-finger contact, which the sporting goods store's structural damage had allowed them to calculate backward from the damage profile. None of those numbers corresponded to any known metahuman ability set. The closest comparisons were Kryptonian adjacent, but Kryptonian adjacent entities had energy signatures that the sensor net was specifically calibrated to detect, and the sensor net had returned nothing. They recommended escalation to the regime's highest-level threat assessment protocol, which was a recommendation the division did not make frequently, and which, when made, had a specific and direct implication for who received the next briefing. Wonder Woman brought it to Superman herself, which was the decision she had been working toward since the preliminary analysis arrived, because the preliminary analysis had confirmed what her first reading of the incident report had suggested, that this was not a situation the regime's standard response architecture was equipped to handle, and the situations that fell outside the standard response architecture were, by design, Superman's situations. He was in the monitor room when she arrived, standing at the main display with the posture he had adopted over years of regime leadership. The specific physical bearing of someone who has spent a long time being the most powerful thing in any room and has learned to carry that fact as a natural state rather than a performed one. She delivered the report directly, without the framing that most people used when bringing Superman information he might find uncomfortable, because direct delivery was the approach he had said he preferred, and because the framing that softened information implied that the recipient needed protection from facts, and implying that Superman needed protection from facts was its own kind of problem. He listened to the full report without interrupting, which was itself information. Superman interrupted reports when the content was within his existing framework, because he could predict where the report was going and redirect it. When he didn't interrupt, it meant the content was outside his existing framework, and he was letting it complete so he had the full picture before responding. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the sensor gap on the main display, the clean absence where a detection signature should have been, the medical beacon activating in a sporting goods store, the damage profiles that didn't match any known entity. He asked about a grocery store, Superman said. It was the detail that required the most processing, and he was doing it out loud, which was something he did rarely. Yes, Wonder Woman said. After removing Marcus Vale from the situation with a two-finger contact, Superman looked at the display for another moment. Marcus's force field has stopped a Kryptonian before, he said, not as a challenge to the report but as a statement of the reference point that made the report's implications clear. The report accounts for that, Wonder Woman said. The blast crater analysis shows the force transferred into the ground rather than the entity. It didn't stop. It had nowhere else to go. Superman turned from the display and looked at her with the expression he used when a situation had produced something he intended to address personally. Find him, he said, before he does something else. In the lower city, 4 hours after the incident, the regime's enhanced response team, 12 metahumans, 3 of them rated above Marcus Vale's capability level, was moving through the district conducting a systematic search pattern. They had sensor equipment calibrated to detect 17 different categories of metahuman energy signature. They had been briefed on the incident report and the preliminary analysis, and they had been given a description that the insurgency sympathizers had provided under questioning, which was accurate as far as it went. Short, bald, yellow suit, white cape, red gloves, unremarkable face, bored expression. The description had been received by the response team with the specific quality of attention that people pay to descriptions that don't match any threat profile they've encountered, which is careful attention layered over deep uncertainty. And they were moving through the district with that attention fully engaged when the team leader's radio produced a report from the northern end of the search pattern. One of the northern team members had located the entity. He was in a convenience store 3 blocks from the original incident site, reading a label on a can of something with the focused attention of someone trying to determine whether a product was worth buying. And the store owner was watching him from behind the counter, with the expression of someone who has recognized that the man reading the label has a hole in his cape from whatever the cape encountered on the way to the store, and who has decided that the correct response to this observation is to say nothing about it. The response team converged on the convenience store from 4 directions simultaneously, which was the approach doctrine for unknown entities with confirmed above-standard capability, and the convergence was clean and professional, and produced exactly the result that convergences on Saitama produced, which was that 12 metahumans arrived at a convenience store and found a short man in a yellow suit at the counter paying for a can of crab meat and a bag of instant rice, who looked at all 12 of them with the mild, evaluating attention of someone who has become accustomed to large groups of people showing up where he is, and said, "Is the curfew over?" The insurgency's intelligence network inside Metropolis was not as comprehensive as the regime's, because the insurgency operated with a fraction of the resources, and none of the institutional authority that the regime could apply to information gathering. But it was in several specific respects more useful than the regime's network, because it was built by people who had learned to work around institutional frameworks rather than through them. And working around institutional frameworks produced a different kind of intelligence than working through them. It produced the kind of intelligence that came from human sources rather than sensor arrays, from people who were present in the ordinary life of the city, rather than monitoring it from elevated positions, from the grocery store owners and the building maintenance workers and the street-level observers who saw things that sensors were not calibrated to see, because sensors were calibrated to detect power signatures and energy outputs and the specific physical phenomena that metahumans produced. And what they were not calibrated to detect was a short, bald man in a yellow suit buying canned goods at a convenience store at the edge of a curfew zone. The insurgency's Metropolis cell coordinator received 3 separate reports about the incident at the parking structure within 2 hours of it occurring, which was fast even by the cell's standards, and reflected the fact that the insurgency's sympathizer network in the lower district was dense enough that major events produced rapid information flow through it. The reports were consistent on the central facts, and inconsistent on the details in the way that eyewitness accounts of genuinely extraordinary events are always inconsistent. The people who saw it had all seen something that their existing frameworks couldn't cleanly accommodate, and the inconsistencies in their accounts reflected the different ways their frameworks had tried and failed to accommodate it, rather than any disagreement about what had actually happened. The coordinator compiled the reports, stripped out the framework failure noise, and transmitted the consolidated summary to the insurgency's central command through the encrypted channel that was the cell's primary communication lifeline, because this was the category of information that required central command's attention rather than local handling. Bruce Wayne received the summary in the insurgency's operations center, which was located in a facility whose existence the regime had been attempting to determine for 2 years without success, and he read it with the complete, undivided attention he brought to everything that arrived through the Metropolis cell's priority channel. He had developed over years of operating against the regime a highly refined ability to assess the reliability of intelligence reports, and the assessment he applied to this summary produced a result that placed it in an unusual category. The summary was reliable, the sources were known and had been accurate before, and the events described were not consistent with any known entity in his database. And his database was the most comprehensive catalog of metahuman and enhanced individual profiles that the Insurgency possessed, which made it the most comprehensive such catalog outside the regime's own systems. He ran the parameters against it anyway, because thoroughness was the discipline that had kept him alive and operational against an opponent with overwhelming force superiority, and the database returned the same result that the regime's preliminary analysis had returned, which was nothing. He pulled the structural damage reports that the Metropolis cell had obtained from sources inside the regime's engineering assessment teams, because the regime's standard procedure after any incident involving enhanced individuals was to conduct structural damage assessment, and the assessments produced numbers that could be worked backward to force calculations. The numbers he worked backward from the sporting goods store damage profile produced force calculations that he ran through 3 separate models before accepting that the models were returning accurate results, because the results were in a range that his models associated with Kryptonian-level physical output, and every Kryptonian-level entity currently on Earth was either part of the regime or was accounted for in his tracking systems. None of them were bald, wore yellow suits, or had been observed buying canned goods in the lower district. He sat with this information for a long time, which for Bruce Wayne meant approximately 4 minutes, which was the specific duration his working practice allowed for the processing of genuinely novel information before the processing converted into action planning, because 4 minutes was long enough to avoid the error of acting before the picture was complete, and short enough to avoid the error of analysis becoming a substitute for action. The action plan he arrived at was the plan he arrived at when an unknown entity of potential significance appeared in an area where the regime was already actively searching. He needed to reach the entity before the regime's response team made contact, because contact with the regime's response team would produce one of 2 outcomes, and neither of them was useful to the Insurgency. If the entity was successfully contained by the regime, the Insurgency lost access to a potential asset before it had been assessed. If the entity was not successfully contained by the regime, and the force calculations suggested that not successfully contained was the more probable outcome, the entity's relationship to the situation would be defined by its first significant interaction, and a first significant interaction with 12 regime metahumans converging in an aggressive tactical pattern was a poor foundation for the kind of careful, trust-building relationship that the Insurgency needed to establish with any entity of unknown motivation and confirmed extraordinary capability. He dispatched 2 Insurgency operatives to the convenience store location with instructions that were specific about their purpose and completely unspecific about their methods, because the methods required adaptation to whatever the situation actually was, and he had learned from years of regime-era operations that overspecified instructions in rapidly changing situations produced people who followed the instructions rather than the intent. The 2 operatives arrived at the convenience store at approximately the same time as the regime's response team, which was not the timing Bruce had intended, but was the timing that the situation produced, and what they found when they arrived was a scene that added several new data points to the picture without resolving any of the central questions. The response team was outside the convenience store in a loose perimeter formation that was tactically correct for containing an unknown entity inside a structure, and the unknown entity was inside the structure, apparently completing a commercial transaction. And the tension between the tactical correctness of the perimeter and the mundanity of what it was containing was producing a specific quality of professional discomfort in the response team members that was visible even from the Insurgency operative's observation position across the street. The team leader was on his communication channel, clearly receiving instructions, and the perimeter was holding rather than moving to contact, which meant the instructions were to contain rather than engage, which meant the regime had decided that the information gap was wide enough that engagement before additional intelligence was a risk they weren't prepared to take, which was, the insurgency operatives noted in their report back to Bruce, an unusual level of operational caution for a regime response team. Inside the store, Saitama paid for his crab and rice, received his change, and turned to find 12 metahumans arranged in a loose circle around the store's interior approaches, all of them looking at him with the focused, controlled attention of people who have been told to observe without engaging, and who are finding the observation more unsettling than the engagement would have been, because observation without engagement required them to simply stand in the presence of something they didn't have a category for, without the action of engagement to structure the experience. He looked at them with the same mild, patient attention he gave everything, and then looked at the store owner, and then looked at the bag with his groceries in it, and then looked at the 12 metahumans again. "Are you all shopping?" he asked. The team leader said very carefully, "Sir, we need you to come with us." Saitama considered this. "Is it far?" he asked. "The rice needs to be cooked while it's fresh." The team leader looked at the response team with the expression of someone whose training had not covered this specific type of encounter, and who was making real-time decisions about how to adapt. Bruce Wayne, receiving the operative's report in the operations center, made a different decision than the one the response team's leader was struggling with, because Bruce had more information and better frameworks, and the specific advantage of not being physically present in a situation that defied his frameworks. He opened a different channel, one that connected to a single relay device that he had placed months ago in the lower district, for exactly the category of situation where direct insurgency contact with an unknown entity needed to happen outside the regime's surveillance architecture. He sent a single message through it, text only, to the number associated with the one insurgency sympathizer in the lower district, who he knew was currently inside the convenience store's immediate vicinity, and who had the specific combination of qualities this moment required: calm under pressure, no combat training that would make them seem threatening, and the kind of ordinary appearance that was itself a form of operational cover. The message said, "Tell the man in the yellow suit that there are people who can answer his questions about where he is and how to get home, and that they'd like to talk before the people outside make talking difficult." Bruce sent the message and watched the feed from the operative's observation position and waited, because waiting was what the situation required, and Bruce Wayne was, when the situation required it, very good at waiting. The message reached the insurgency sympathizer inside the convenience store through a cheap burner phone that buzzed once in his jacket pocket, and he read it in the 3 seconds it took the response team leader to finish his sentence about coming with them, and he made the decision that the message required him to make in the time it took him to put the phone back in his pocket, which was fast but not suspiciously fast, because he was a man who had been making rapid decisions in high-pressure situations for 3 years of insurgency work, and had become very good at making them look like ordinary thought. His name was Daniel, and he was 31 years old, and he had been in the convenience store buying bread when everything started happening around him, and he had stayed because leaving during a regime response team deployment attracted the kind of attention that insurgency sympathizers specifically could not afford to attract. And he was now going to do something that his insurgency training had not covered, because his insurgency training had not been designed for situations involving unknown entities, from what the preliminary cell reports were describing as a potentially different dimension entirely. He looked at Saitama, who was still holding his grocery bag and looking at the response team with the patient, evaluating attention of someone waiting for a situation to clarify itself, and he said, quietly enough that the response team's nearest member could not quite hear it over the ambient tension of the room, There are people who can tell you where you are and how to get home. They want to talk. We need to leave in the next 30 seconds. Saitama looked at him. He looked at the grocery bag. He looked at the 12 metahumans and the team leader who had resumed his communication channel conversation and appeared to be receiving updated instructions that were producing visible uncertainty in his expression. He looked back at Daniel. Getting home is the main thing, he said, at the same volume Daniel had used. Okay, Daniel said. Side door, now. They left through the side door, which opened onto an alley that connected to a maintenance corridor that connected to a transit route that Daniel knew, because he had mapped the lower district's secondary movement paths the way all long-term insurgency operatives mapped them. Not from a tactical document, but from physical memory, from having walked them enough times that the routes were stored in his body rather than his mind, and could be accessed without the delay of conscious recall. The response team outside registered their exit approximately 45 seconds after they had cleared the alley, which was 45 seconds longer than it should have taken, but which reflected the specific operational confusion of a team that had been instructed to observe without engaging and had been watching the wrong door. By the time the response team reported the exit to their command channel, Saitama and Daniel were 3 blocks away, and moving through a part of the lower district that the regime's sensor coverage handled less completely than the main corridors, and the regime's response architecture was transitioning from containment mode to pursuit mode, which was a slower transition than it should have been because the command structure above the response team was still processing what the response team's own uncertainty about how to approach a direct engagement said about the entity's threat level. In the regime's monitoring station, the analyst who had filed the original priority report was watching the transition happen and nodding its pace and filing a secondary report that the primary report had produced response protocols that were slower than the entity's apparent mobility, which was the kind of institutional observation that arrives too late to affect the immediate situation, but becomes significant in the retrospective analysis that follows it. Wonder Woman received the pursuit report and the secondary report simultaneously, and made a decision that was characteristically hers in its combination of tactical decisiveness and strategic patience. She did not deploy additional response assets to the pursuit, because additional response assets in the lower district's secondary movement corridors would produce a saturation pattern that was slow and visible, and would drive the entity toward the insurgency's network rather than toward regime contact, which was the opposite of the operational objective. Instead, she redirected the sensor coverage architecture to prioritize the lower district comprehensively, accepting the coverage gaps elsewhere that this produced, because the entity's consistent evasion of sensor detection was a capability that needed to be understood before any further deployment decisions were made. And the only way to understand a sensor evasion capability was to saturate the environment with sensors and observe what the evasion looked like at maximum coverage density. She noted her decision in the operational log with the specific documentation discipline of someone who understood that every decision made about this entity would eventually be reviewed by Superman, and wanted the reasoning to be clear, because clear reasoning was the best available defense against being held accountable for outcomes that the reasoning had not been able to predict. Saitama and Daniel moved through the lower district for 20 minutes before Daniel's next instruction arrived through the burner phone, which directed them to a specific basement access point 2 blocks north of their current position. Saitama followed the route with the cooperative patience of someone who has decided that the person leading them probably knows where they're going and that following is more efficient than questioning, and he spent the transit looking at the city around him with the attentive, cataloging gaze he applied to unfamiliar environments, noting the regime's visible presence on every main corridor. The patrol patterns, the surveillance equipment, the specific quality of how ordinary people moved through a heavily monitored space, which was with the slightly compressed body language of people who had learned to take up less room in their own city. He had seen cities before that had the quality this one had, the quality of being occupied by something that had decided it was in charge. And he found it mildly interesting in the way of something that told him something about where he was without telling him how he had gotten there or how to get back. The basement they reached was one of the Insurgency's secondary safe house network nodes, small and functional, and containing exactly the equipment and personnel that the network node's function required: communication gear, a medical kit, 2 Insurgency operatives who had been prepositioned by Bruce's instruction, and a monitor displaying a secure video feed that connected to the Insurgency's operations center. Bruce Wayne's face on the monitor was the same face it always was in these briefings: controlled, analytical, the specific quality of attention that contained both assessment and patience in equal measure, the face of someone who had decided that information was more valuable than impression, and who therefore showed nothing that wasn't operationally relevant. He looked at Saitama for a moment before speaking, doing the initial assessment that his training made automatic: the physical parameters, the damage to the cape, the grocery bag still in his hand, the expression that was mildly curious in a way that was genuine rather than performed. "Your name is Saitama," Bruce said, because the cell reports had contained it. Saitama looked at him on the monitor and then at the room and then back at Bruce. "Yeah," he said. "Who are you?" Bruce considered how to answer this in a way that was accurate, useful, and didn't require 20 minutes of context that the situation didn't have time for. "Someone who wants the same things you want," he said, "which is to understand what's happening and to make sure the people in the yellow suits outside don't make it harder." Saitama looked at the monitor for a moment and then set his grocery bag down on the nearest surface. "Okay," he said. "Can someone cook this rice while we talk?" The city learned his name in the way that cities learned things in the regime era, which was not through official announcements or media reports, but through the informal channels that had replaced both of those things as the primary information distribution system for anyone who needed to know what was actually happening as opposed to what the regime said was happening. The lower district's network had it within hours: the name Saitama, the yellow suit, the parking structure incident, the convenience store, the response team's 45-second failure to register his exit. It moved from the lower district network to the mid-city network, and from the mid-city network to the Insurgency's broader intelligence web. And in each transmission, it acquired the specific additions and modifications that information acquires as it moves through human networks, which was not distortion in the pejorative sense, but the natural process of each new recipient adding the analytical layer their own framework provided. By the time it reached the Insurgency's regional cells outside Metropolis, the information had been through enough analytical layers that its core facts were still intact, and its implications had been partially worked out. And the implication that most of the analytical layers had independently converged on was the one that was most significant and most carefully worded in every version of the transmission, because the people transmitting it understood that significant information required careful wording. The implication was this: there is someone in Metropolis who the regime's response architecture could not contain, and the regime knows it, and the regime is deciding what to do about it, and whatever the regime decides will tell us something important about how afraid they are. In the Hall of Justice, Superman had read Wonder Woman's operational log entry and the response team's pursuit report and the secondary sensor analysis, and he was standing at the main display looking at the lower district's coverage map and the gap where Saitama had been and was no longer. And he was feeling something that he had spent years constructing an existence that did not produce in him, and which was therefore unfamiliar enough to require a moment of identification before he could process it properly. It was not quite anger, because anger required a target that had done something that justified the anger, and what Saitama had done was buy canned goods and walk away, which was not an action that anger was a proportionate response to. It was not quite concern, because concern required an assessment that the situation was threatening in a way that he couldn't address, and there was no situation on this planet that he had assessed as threatening in that way for a very long time. It was something smaller and more specific than either of those things, and he identified it after a moment as the specific discomfort of encountering something that had not responded to his world the way his world had been responding to everything for years, which was with awareness of the power structure and adjustment of behavior accordingly. Saitama had not adjusted his behavior. He had bought rice. Superman looked at the gap in the coverage map and made a decision that he communicated to Wonder Woman in 4 words: "I'll find him myself." Superman's personal involvement in a ground-level search operation was not something that happened often in the regime era, because Superman's personal involvement in anything ground-level was a resource allocation decision that the regime's operational logic reserved for situations where the scale of the problem justified the deployment of its most significant asset. And the regime's most significant asset was not a tool that should be applied to problems that the institutional architecture could resolve through standard means. This calculus had governed his operational decisions since the early consolidation period and had produced a consistent pattern. He appeared when buildings fell, when governments resisted, when threats operated at a scale that required the specific combination of his physical capability and the symbolic weight of his presence, which was itself a form of force that complemented the physical kind. He did not appear for unknown entities in the lower district who had disrupted a single enforcement operation and declined to be found by a 12-person response team. He had not appeared for anything of that scale in years. The fact that he was now moving through Metropolis at low altitude in the gray pre-dawn hour, scanning the lower district with the comprehensive sensory suite that his Kryptonian biology provided, was information that the regime's own operational personnel noted in their logs with the specific careful neutrality of people who understood that nodding it was appropriate and commenting on what it meant was not. He moved methodically, which was characteristic of how he operated when the objective was information rather than force application. The heat vision sweep, the audio focus, the comprehensive layering of sensory input that let him process a city block in the time it took a normal person to look at a building's facade. He had been scanning for 40 minutes when he found what he was looking for, not through any of the Kryptonian sensory systems, but through the oldest and most reliable detection method available, which was the simple observation that a group of regime patrol units on the eastern edge of the lower district had stopped moving in the pattern that patrol units moved in when they were patrolling, and had begun moving in the pattern that patrol units moved in when something had caught their attention. He redirected toward them and found, on a rooftop 3 blocks east of the patrol unit's position, Saitama sitting on the edge of a water tower's access platform, eating rice from a bowl with the focused, appreciative attention of someone who has been waiting for a meal and is now having it. The rice had been cooked in the safe house while Bruce's briefing was happening, and Saitama had eaten half of it during the briefing and brought the other half with him when the briefing concluded, and the safe house had been vacated. Vacated because Bruce had assessed that the regime's saturation coverage of the lower district made the safe house's continued use inadvisable for the next 12 hours, and because the operatives who had been prepositioned there had other assignments, and because Saitama had looked at the question of where he was going to spend the night with the practical simplicity of someone for whom sleeping outside was not a problem, and finding a roof was sufficient. The briefing had given him information that was genuinely useful. He knew now that the yellow suits outside were called the regime, that the conflict he had landed in the middle of was a war between 2 groups of people with powers, and that the man on the monitor whose name he had eventually learned was Bruce was trying to end that war from the losing side. He had listened to all of this with the attentive patience he brought to new information, and had arrived at the same simple assessment he always arrived at when someone explained a complex situation to him. He understood the situation well enough to navigate it practically, and not well enough to have an opinion about which side was right, and the question of which side was right was less immediately relevant than the question of how to get home. And getting home required the dimensional displacement research that Bruce had told him the Insurgency's archives might contain if they could access the right materials, which was a project that was going to take time. And while it took time, he was going to need to eat, and the rice was good. Superman landed on the rooftop with the specific, controlled deployment of someone who has arrived with intent and wants the arrival itself to communicate that intent, which it did. The displaced air from his landing moved across the rooftop in a pressure wave that rippled the surface of Saitama's rice and rattled the water tower's access hatch. And the visual presentation of Superman in full regime configuration at close range on a rooftop in the pre-dawn gray was a presentation that had produced immediate behavioral responses in every person and every enhanced individual who had experienced it since the early consolidation period. He was not attempting to intimidate, exactly. Intimidation was a tool he used when a situation required compliance that might not otherwise be forthcoming, and this situation was too undefined for compliance to be the objective yet. He was communicating presence and authority in the way that had become as natural to him as breathing, because presence and authority were what he was, had been for years, and their communication was not a performance but a state. He looked at Saitama, who had looked up from his rice at the sound of the landing, and was now looking at Superman with the same mild, evaluating attention he had applied to the response team, and to Bruce's monitor face, and to the droid formations at Geonosis, which was to say the specific quality of attention that contained assessment without any of the reactive components that assessment usually came packaged with. "You're the one from the parking structure," Superman said. It was the opening he had chosen after 40 minutes of scanning, which was enough time for the opening to be deliberate rather than improvised. Saitama looked at him. "I was looking for a grocery store," he said. "I've heard," Superman said, and there was something in the two words that was not quite the tone he had intended, a quality that arrived from somewhere in the gap between the situation as he had modeled it and the situation as it actually was, and the gap was wider than he had anticipated. He had modeled the conversation as one where he established his authority, and the unknown entity responded to that authority in one of the ways that entities responded to it: compliance, defiance, negotiation, or the specific kind of fear that manifested as aggression, and then he worked with whatever the response was. The model did not have a response category for someone who acknowledged the reference with mild interest and kept eating rice. "What are you?" he asked, which was a question he had not planned to ask this early but which the model's failure had made feel like the most direct path to useful information. Saitama considered this with genuine thought because he took questions seriously even when they were asked by people in intimidating configurations on pre-dawn rooftops. "A hero," he said, "for fun." Superman looked at him for a moment. "For fun," he repeated. "Yeah," Saitama said. "It's more of a hobby. I don't get paid." What happened next was the thing that the regime's response team had experienced, and Marcus Vale had experienced, and every entity in every universe that had encountered Saitama eventually experienced, which was that the framework the encounter had been structured around failed to apply to the person being encountered, and the failure produced a specific kind of operational stall in the party whose framework it was. Superman had a framework for unknown metahumans of significant capability. He had dealt with many of them, had assessed them, had given them the choice between the regime and the alternative, and the framework had been reliable because it was built on the foundational assumption that capability existed within a power hierarchy, and that sufficient position in that hierarchy produced the appropriate behavioral responses in those below it. He was at the top of the hierarchy, had been for years, and everything below him had responded accordingly. He reached out now with the authority that came from that position, not the physical kind but the practiced, projected kind that had become part of how he occupied any space he entered, and directed it at Saitama with the intention of producing in him the awareness of where in the hierarchy he stood. Saitama ate the last of his rice, set the bowl down beside him on the access platform, and looked at Superman with the expression of someone who has just finished a satisfying meal and is returning attention to the room. "Can you help me get home?" he asked. Superman experienced something that required more than one word to accurately describe, which was the specific compound experience of a person whose projected authority has landed on a surface that does not reflect it back, and who has realized in real time that the surface was not resistant to the authority. It was simply not in a category that the authority applied to, the way gravity doesn't apply to things that aren't mass. He looked at Saitama on the rooftop, with the water tower behind him and the pre-dawn Metropolis skyline spreading out around them, and felt the compound experience settle into something quieter and more uncomfortable than irritation, which was the preliminary recognition of an assessment he was not ready to complete. He made a decision that was uncharacteristic in the specific sense that it was a deferral rather than an action. He needed more information before this conversation could produce anything useful, and deferring until he had it was the correct tactical choice, and he made it and left the rooftop with the same controlled deployment as his arrival, because the departure needed to communicate as much as the arrival had. From the rooftop, Saitama watched him go and then looked at the empty bowl beside him, and then at the Metropolis skyline in the gray early light, thinking about nothing in particular. Wonder Woman learned about the rooftop conversation through Superman's own account, which he delivered in the Hall of Justice's briefing room approximately 2 hours after leaving the rooftop, and the account was accurate in every factual particular and completely uninformative about the thing that mattered most, which was what Superman had concluded from the conversation. He described the exchange precisely: the rice, the grocery store, the hero for fun, the request about getting home, and he described his decision to withdraw pending additional intelligence, and he framed the decision in the language of tactical patience, which was the language that the regime used for operational choices that required justification. And Wonder Woman listened to the account and the framing, and noted both with the careful attention she brought to everything Superman told her about decisions he had made, because the gap between what he said about his decisions and what had actually driven them was information that she had been tracking for a long time, and which she kept in a separate mental file from the operational data. The gap in this account was the specific absence of any characterization of what the conversation had felt like from Superman's position, which was an absence that was itself a characterization, because Superman did not omit emotional content from his accounts of significant interactions, unless the emotional content was something he had decided not to examine yet. She requested permission to conduct her own assessment, framing it as a redundant intelligence-gathering exercise that would produce data to complement Superman's direct observation, which was a framing that was technically accurate, and which gave Superman a reason to agree that didn't require him to acknowledge that his own direct observation had produced an incomplete picture. He agreed, and she left the briefing room and made 2 calls, the first to the regime's intelligence division, tasking them with compiling everything available on the rooftop interaction sensory record, and the second to Hal Jordan, whose particular set of capabilities and analytical orientation made him the most useful partner for an assessment of an entity whose fundamental nature was outside the standard framework. Jordan had been a regime loyalist from early in the consolidation period, had made his peace with the regime's methods in the way that people who are fundamentally decent make peace with things they have decided are necessary, and he brought to regime operations the specific combination of power and lingering conscience that made him both effective and occasionally difficult to manage. She briefed him on the entity and the incident history and the rooftop conversation, and watched his face as he processed it with the same careful attention she brought to Superman's face in situations like this, because the faces of capable people processing genuinely novel information were more informative than anything they said about it. Jordan's response was to ask the question that the Intelligence Division's preliminary analysis had not asked, which was not what is this entity, and where did it come from, but rather what does the entity's behavior pattern tell us about its relationship to the situation it's in. He made this distinction because his experience with ring constructs and the willpower mechanics of the Green Lantern power system had given him a framework for understanding power that was less hierarchical than most of the regime's analytical models. He understood power as something that had a relationship to its source, and that the relationship to the source defined the power's character more than its magnitude did. And what he was hearing about Saitama suggested a relationship to power that was unlike anything in his experience or the regime's analytical library. The entity was not using power in the service of any goal, was not deploying capability in response to threat or opportunity, was not positioning itself within any framework that power was usually deployed within. It was simply existing at a capability level that the framework couldn't accommodate and appearing to be entirely unaware of the framework's existence. Jordan said this to Wonder Woman, and then said the thing that the analysis implied, which was, if he doesn't know the framework exists, he can't be placed inside it. And if he can't be placed inside it, then everything the framework is built on stops applying when he's in the picture. Wonder Woman took this assessment back to her separate mental file and added it to what was already there. And what was already there had been building since the initial incident report and now had enough data points to support a conclusion she had been approaching and had not yet fully formulated, because fully formulating, it required her to acknowledge something about the regime's foundational architecture that she had been working around rather than through. The regime's authority rested on Superman's power, and Superman's power rested on the assumption that it was the ultimate expression of what physical force could be in this world, and the entity in the yellow suit was evidence that the assumption was wrong. She had known this intellectually since the force calculations came back from the sporting goods store damage assessment. What the Rooftop conversation confirmed was that the entity's relationship to the assumption's wrongness was entirely unconscious, which was the specific detail that made the situation significantly more complicated than a conventional challenge to Superman's authority would have been. A conscious challenge could be met with demonstration, negotiation, or force. An unconscious one couldn't be met with any of those things because it wasn't operating in the register that any of those responses addressed. In the Insurgency's operations center, Bruce had received the Insurgency cell's account of the Rooftop interaction through the lower district network within an hour of it occurring, and he was building a tactical picture from it with the systematic efficiency of someone whose analytical process had been running continuously since the first incident report arrived. The picture had several elements that were now confirmed and several that remained speculative, and the boundary between confirmed and speculative was important to maintain, because the decisions that came from the picture needed to be grounded in what was actually known rather than what the framework suggested should be true. What was confirmed? Saitama's physical capability exceeded the regime's response architecture at every level tested so far. His sensor invisibility was consistent and appeared to be a property of his existence rather than a deliberate capability. His motivation was singular and practical. He wanted to go home and was not aligned with either faction's agenda. He had accepted help from the Insurgency contact in the convenience store and had attended a briefing, which suggested a basic cooperative orientation toward people who offered assistance without agenda. And he had met Superman on a rooftop and had asked about getting home, which meant that the Rooftop conversation had not produced a Superman-aligned outcome, which meant the regime's most significant asset had encountered the entity directly, and the encounter had ended inconclusively. And inconclusive was not a category that Superman's track record contained. What was speculative but increasingly well-supported was the question of what Saitama's capability ceiling actually was, and this was the question that determined everything else about how the Insurgency approached its relationship with him. The force calculations from existing interactions gave a lower bound that was already extraordinary, but lower bounds were definitionally not ceilings, and the entity had not yet been observed in a situation that required anything approaching full engagement. Bruce had been trying to construct scenarios that would allow him to assess the ceiling, without creating a situation that damaged the cooperative relationship he was attempting to build. And he had been finding the construction difficult because every scenario that would produce useful ceiling data was also a scenario that put the cooperative relationship at risk. He was still working through this problem when the new report came in from the lower district cell, which was not about Saitama directly but about the regime, and specifically about a deployment that Wonder Woman had authorized in the lower district that was different in kind from the response team and the saturation coverage, and all the other measures the regime had applied since the first incident. She had deployed regime enforcers to the dimensional displacement research archives that the Insurgency had been attempting to access for Saitama's return home. The specific locations where the pre-regime physics research files were stored, the theoretical materials that Bruce had told Saitama the Insurgency's archive access program was targeting. The regime had gotten to them first, which meant either that their intelligence had penetrated the Insurgency's archive access program, or that Wonder Woman had independently identified the same research materials as strategically relevant, and had acted on the identification before Bruce could. Either interpretation was concerning, and the second interpretation was concerning in a specific way that went beyond the immediate operational problem, because if Wonder Woman had identified the dimensional displacement research as strategically relevant independently, it meant she had concluded that controlling the timeline of Saitama's potential departure was a regime interest, which meant the regime had decided that Saitama's presence in this world was something to be managed rather than something to be resolved, and managing rather than resolving was a significantly more sophisticated strategic orientation than anything the regime had applied to an unknown entity before. Bruce sent a priority message to the lower district cell and then opened the channel to the relay device and sent a different message, this one directly to the burner phone that Daniel was still carrying, which was the only communication line he had that connected to Saitama's current position. The message was 3 sentences, and each sentence was chosen with the precision that the situation required. The regime has seized the research archives. They are trying to keep you here. We need to move faster than we planned. Saitama read Bruce's message on Daniel's burner phone with the focused, literal attention he applied to written communications, which was the attention of someone who read things for their informational content rather than their subtext, because the subtext required a framework for the situation that he was still building, and the informational content was immediately usable. The 3 sentences were clear. The research was gone. The people in the blue suits had taken it, and the timeline needed to move faster. He handed the phone back to Daniel and sat for a moment on the edge of the rooftop where he had slept, the early morning Metropolis skyline spreading out around them, the city below beginning to produce the sounds of its own managed daily life. And he thought about the situation in the simple, practical way he thought about everything, which meant starting from what he wanted and working backward through what was between him and it. What he wanted was to go home. What was between him and it was research that no longer existed in the location the Insurgency had planned to access. Research that was now inside a regime-controlled facility somewhere in the city, and a regime that had made the decision to control the research rather than allow it to be used for his departure, which meant the regime had decided his departure was something it could benefit from preventing. He worked through this chain and arrived at the end of it and noted the end of it, and then asked Daniel the most practically relevant question available. Where did they take it? Daniel didn't know, which was the answer Saitama had expected, because Daniel was a cell-level operative whose information about regime facility locations was limited to what the cell network had mapped through ground-level observation, and regime secure storage facilities were not mapped at the cell level. Bruce would know, or would be finding out, and Bruce's communication had said we need to move faster, which implied Bruce had a plan or was forming one, and the plan would produce an answer to the location question when it was ready. This was the kind of wait that Saitama found more tolerable than the waiting for research kind of wait, because it had a clearer endpoint and a clearer action attached to the endpoint. And waiting with a clear action coming was categorically different from waiting without one. He stood up and stretched in the way that he did in the mornings, which was the full training warm-up stretch sequence performed in about 45 seconds, because his relationship with his body's preparation requirements had been simplified to the point of near elimination by years of training that had made the preparation irrelevant. And he looked at the city and thought about breakfast, and about the regime, and about the research. And these three things occupied separate and roughly equal portions of his attention, in a way that a less experienced observer might have found disconcerting. Bruce sent the location through the relay device 2 hours later, and the location came with a briefing document that was more detailed than the safe house briefing had been, because the safe house briefing had been conducted under time pressure and with incomplete information, and this briefing was conducted in writing, and with the information that 2 hours of insurgency intelligence work had produced. The facility was a regime-secure storage and research annex in Metropolis's administrative district, 6 stories underground, protected by 3 layers of physical security, and a monitoring architecture that connected directly to the Hall of Justice's alert system. The dimensional displacement research files were the most recent addition to a collection of pre-regime theoretical physics materials that the regime had been systematically centralizing since the early consolidation period, both for the utility value of the research and for the strategic value of controlling access to it. The briefing document included floor schematics that the Insurgency's network had obtained through sources inside the facility's maintenance contractor, entry approach recommendations, security schedule windows, and a paragraph at the end that Bruce had written last and which was the most honest paragraph in the document, which said, "Standard infiltration approach is assessed as high risk given current saturation coverage of the administrative district, and the assessment acknowledges that the entity's sensor invisibility may substantially alter the risk calculation in ways that cannot be fully modeled from available data." Saitama read the briefing document with the same focused, literal attention, and then read it again, because the floor schematics required orientation work that took longer than the text, and he arrived at the end of it with a working understanding of the facility's layout and a completely different plan than the infiltration approach Bruce had outlined. The infiltration approach was built on the assumption that entry needed to be covert, because covert was how humans navigated situations involving superior opposing force. You found the gaps in the opposing force's coverage and moved through them before the coverage could close. He understood why humans needed to do it this way, and he also understood that the logic of the approach didn't apply to him, because the gaps in the opposing force's coverage were relevant when the opposing force could stop you if you weren't in a gap, and the regime's opposing force had already demonstrated that it couldn't stop him even when he was fully visible in the middle of a convenience store. He sent a reply through Daniel's phone that was 5 words, "I'll go through the front." Bruce's response came back in 4 words, "That will alert Superman." Saitama read this and thought about it and sent a reply that was 8 words and which Bruce read in the operations center, and which produced a silence that the 2 insurgency operatives present with him noted and said nothing about, because the operatives had learned that Bruce's silences were processing events rather than communication failures. The reply said, "Superman already knows where I am anyway." Bruce looked at this for a moment, and then looked at the operational map of the administrative district, and then looked at the timeline he had been building since the first incident report, and made an assessment that was uncomfortable and accurate, and that he converted into operational planning rather than sitting with, because sitting with uncomfortable accurate assessments was not how the insurgency had survived 3 years against the regime. He sent back a single word, timing. And then he sent the timing window, The 12-minute period in the security schedule, where the facility's alert system connection to the Hall of Justice ran through a single relay point that the Insurgency's network could disrupt for approximately 4 minutes, which was 4 minutes of reduced Hall of Justice awareness, during which whatever happened at the facility would take longer to reach Superman's direct attention. It was a narrow window, and it was the only window available, and it required Saitama to move through the administrative district in daylight during active regime patrol coverage, which under ordinary circumstances was a description of an approach that didn't work, and Saitama was not ordinary circumstances. He arrived at the facility's main entrance at the precise start of the timing window, walking at the same unhurried pace he used for everything, wearing the same yellow suit he had been wearing since his arrival, because it was what he had, and the facility's external security responded to the approach of an unknown individual at the main entrance during active operations, hours the way external security responds to anything that falls outside its expected pattern, which was to deploy the personnel assigned to the entry point and demand identification. There were 4 of them, 2 human regime security officers and 2 metahuman enforcers whose specific capabilities the briefing document had noted as electrokinetic projection and enhanced physical strength respectively. They arrayed themselves across the entrance with the professional spacing of people who had been trained in entry point defense and demanded identification with the language that regime security used for demands, which was the language of authority that expected compliance before it expected resistance. Saitama looked at them with mild attention and said, "I need something from inside." The electrokinetic enforcer projected a sustained charge that was designed for incapacitation of enhanced targets, and it hit Saitama and produced the result that energy-based attacks on Saitama consistently produced, which was a brief visual effect around his suit as the energy dispersed across the surface and dissipated, and then Saitama walked through the entry point. And the 4 security personnel were distributed across the entrance plaza in various configurations that all shared the characteristic of not blocking the door anymore. The 4 minutes of disrupted Hall of Justice alert connectivity began at the moment the first security contact was made, which meant that Saitama had 4 minutes from the point of entry to locate the research materials before Superman received an alert that was full and direct, rather than filtered through the relay disruption. He moved through the facility with the floor schematic held in memory. He had read it twice, which was enough, and navigated the interior corridors at a pace that was faster than his outdoor walking pace but not running, because running implied urgency and urgency implied that something in the facility could produce urgency in him, and nothing in the facility could. The 3 physical security layers between the entry point and the research storage level were addressed with the same minimal contact approach he used for things he was trying not to destroy completely, and the research storage level was reached in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, which left 1 minute and 20 seconds in the disruption window. The storage system was a physical archive with a digital access layer, and the digital access layer required credentials he didn't have, so he addressed it the way he addressed things that required credentials he didn't have, which was to remove the section of wall adjacent to the storage system's physical housing and retrieve the research files from the housing directly. He walked back through the facility with the research files in his hand, stepped over the security personnel in the entrance plaza who were beginning the slow process of recovering from being distributed across it, and walked out into the Metropolis Administrative District daylight, which was at that moment 15 seconds past the end of the disruption window, which meant that the Hall of Justice's alert system had reconnected in time to capture the last 15 seconds of what had happened. And the alert that arrived at the Hall of Justice was an alert that said, in the dry, factual language of automated security systems, that the regime secure storage and research annex in the administrative district had experienced a breach event in which the dimensional displacement research files had been removed from storage and the entry security personnel had been incapacitated. And the alert included the facility's external camera footage of the last 90 seconds before the disruption window closed, which showed a bald man in a yellow suit walking out the front door carrying a folder. Superman read the alert in the monitor room with the specific quality of attention that had replaced the preliminary recognition from the rooftop, and which was now something more fully formed. And what it was fully formed into was a clear and definitive assessment that the operational approach the regime had been applying to this situation since the beginning: containment, monitoring, seizure of the relevant research, management of the timeline, had produced the result that approaches built on the wrong foundational assumptions always produce, which was the opposite of their intended outcome. The research was gone, the facility security was incapacitated, and the entity had walked out the front door carrying a folder. He left the Hall of Justice and flew toward the administrative district, and this time the departure did not have the controlled, communicative quality of the rooftop departure. And Wonder Woman, watching him go from the monitor room, noted the difference and added it to her separate mental file, where it sat alongside everything else she had been accumulating, and the file was now large enough that the conclusion it supported was no longer preliminary. Superman found Saitama 4 blocks from the facility, walking in the direction of the lower district with the research folder under his arm and a street vendor's paper-wrapped sandwich in his other hand. Because the administrative district had street vendors and the timing window's execution had been around midday, and he had been awake since before dawn and had not eaten since the rice. The city around them was active with Metropolis's managed daily life. People moving through the administrative district's main corridors on the business that the regime's order had made the texture of ordinary existence. The patrol presence light in this section compared to the lower district, the surveillance architecture present but not saturating. Superman descended into the street ahead of Saitama, and the people in the immediate vicinity responded to his appearance the way people in regime-era Metropolis responded to Superman appearing in a city street, which was by removing themselves from the space as quickly and quietly as possible. Because the space around Superman when he appeared with intent in a public location was not a space that ordinary people wanted to be in. And they had learned this over years in the specific way that populations learn things under authority structures that are total, not through any explicit instruction, but through accumulated observation of what happened in spaces like that. The street cleared in approximately 30 seconds, leaving Saitama and Superman in a corridor of empty pavement flanked by ordinary Metropolis architecture, office buildings, a transit station entrance, a closed storefront, with the sounds of the city continuing at one remove, behind the cleared space, in the way of something that has stepped back from a situation it recognizes without fully understanding. Superman looked at the research folder under Saitama's arm and at the sandwich in his hand and at Saitama's expression, which was the same expression it had been on the rooftop and in the convenience store, and at every other point in this story so far: mild, attentive, present without urgency. "You took that from a secured regime facility," Superman said. It was not the opening he had used on the rooftop which had been chosen for information gathering, and it was not framed as a question because it wasn't a question. Saitama looked at him. "I needed it," he said. "It's research about how to get home." Superman looked at him for a moment. "That research was confiscated by the regime," he said, "which means it belongs to the regime." Saitama thought about this with the honest, earnest consideration he brought to propositions that had an internal logic he was trying to evaluate. "That doesn't really seem right," he said, after a moment. The conversation had the same quality as the rooftop conversation and the convenience store conversation, and every other conversation anyone had attempted with Saitama in this world, which was the quality of two parties operating from frameworks so different that communication was happening at the surface level, while the actual orientations that generated the communication remained in entirely separate registers. Superman understood this, in the sense that he had enough information now to see the pattern, and the pattern's visibility did not make it easier to address, because addressing it required engaging with Saitama on his own terms rather than on the regime's terms. And the regime's terms were the only terms Superman had been operating in for so long that engaging outside them required an effort of translation that felt, from the inside, like a kind of loss. He made a different choice than he had made on the rooftop, where he had deferred because deferral was the tactical choice. The tactical choice now was different because the situation had changed. The research was already removed. The facility security was already incapacitated. The alert had already been sent, and the regime's intelligence about Saitama's capabilities was already comprehensive enough that whatever he did in the next few minutes was going to be witnessed, recorded, and incorporated into the regime's institutional understanding of this situation. He needed the outcome of this encounter to mean something for the regime's authority, and the only way an outcome meant something for the regime's authority was if the outcome demonstrated that the regime's authority applied. He hit Saitama, not a full Kryptonian punch, because full Kryptonian punches in city streets produce structural damage at a scale that even the regime's authority found difficult to frame as order maintenance, but a significant directed strike with enough force behind it that the previous two encounters had given him reason to believe it would at minimum produce a physical result that established a reference point for where the entity stood in relation to his own capabilities. The strike connected with Saitama's shoulder, and the surrounding architecture registered it. Windows in the buildings on both sides of the street fractured from the pressure wave. The transit station entrance behind Saitama shed a section of its facade cladding. The pavement under Saitama's feet developed a radial crack patterned from the force that transferred downward when his body declined to receive it. Saitama himself moved 2 inches to the left, which was the distance the force had managed to translate into physical displacement, and he looked at his shoulder where the strike had landed, and then back at Superman with the expression he used when something had captured his genuine attention rather than just his mild interest, which was still a calm expression, but had a quality of focus that was slightly sharper than the baseline. He ate the last of his sandwich and folded the wrapper with the patient neatness of someone who doesn't like to litter, looked for a moment at the debris from the transit station facade, and then looked at Superman with the specific quality of attention that arrived when he had assessed a situation and reached a conclusion about it. The conclusion was the same conclusion he reached in every situation where something hit him hard enough to get his attention. Not anger, not aggression, but a simple practical assessment that the situation had produced a question that needed answering. And the question was whether what had just hit him was the most that this particular opponent was capable of, because the answer to that question determined everything about how to relate to the situation going forward. He had asked this question about Carnage and Burroughs and various monster-level threats in his own universe, and the answer had always been the same, and he was asking it now, and the answer was arriving the same way it always arrived, which was as a combination of the physical data from the impact and the intuitive reading of the person in front of him. And the answer was producing the familiar quiet conclusion that followed the familiar quiet question. Superman had made the assessment before the strike landed that he would know what he needed to know from the strike's result, and the result was now available, and he was processing it. And what he was processing was the fact that 2 inches of displacement and fractured windows and facade shedding was not consistent with the force he had put into the strike. And the inconsistency told him something about the mechanism that the regime's force calculations had described as force transferring into the ground rather than the entity, which he had understood analytically before the strike, and understood differently now that he had felt it in his hand. It was not resistance. Resistance was something you felt in the impact, the specific feedback of force meeting force. What he had felt was the absence of resistance, which was different, and the absence of resistance meant that his strike had encountered something that was not opposing it or absorbing it or deflecting it. It had simply arrived at something that the strike did not apply to, and the force had gone somewhere else because there was nowhere for it to go that was Saitama. He looked at the 2 inches of displacement and thought about what his own full strike was capable of producing in the things it had produced results in before, and he performed the comparison, and the comparison produced a number that was not a comfortable number. Saitama set the research folder down on a section of intact pavement and looked at Superman and raised his fist, and the raising was not theatrical and was not accompanied by any change in his expression or any visible preparation of any kind. And Superman had enough combat experience to read the absence of preparation accurately, which was as the preparation of someone who didn't need any, and he made the choice that the reading of that signal required him to make, which was to bring his full Kryptonian defensive capability to bear before the fist arrived. He did this. He brought everything, the invulnerability, the practiced bracing, the full physical and biological armor that 5 yellow sun-charged years had built into him, and he brought it to bear on the point of impact, and the fist arrived. The block they were standing on ceased to have pavement in a 30-meter radius. The buildings on either side of the street lost their ground floors simultaneously, the structural loads redistributing upward in the way that structural loads do when the base of a load-bearing system is suddenly and completely removed, and both buildings settled into a partial collapse configuration that was catastrophic at the base and largely intact above, which was an architectural outcome that should not have been physically achievable, but was the consequence of a force event that had expressed itself primarily outward and downward rather than spherically, because the force had a direction. Superman was at the end of the direction. He was in the transit station's underground concourse, having traveled there through the transit station entrance and the pavement and the concourse's ceiling, and he was conscious, and he was intact in every technical sense, and he was lying on the concourse floor looking up at the hole he had made in coming through it with the specific look of a person who has just received information that reorganizes everything around it. The way information does when it arrives with physical force sufficient to make it undeniable. Saitama was standing at street level at the edge of the crater, looking down at Superman in the concourse below, and the expression on his face was the familiar one, the quiet, slightly disappointed recognition of a conclusion he had reached before and had been reaching repeatedly across years of encounters with the upper limits of what his universe contained. He had hit Superman as hard as he could hit anything, and Superman was getting up. Superman got up slowly. This was the detail that mattered most to everyone who would eventually receive the account of what had happened on that Metropolis street, because slowly was not a word that had applied to Superman's physical recovery from anything in years, possibly ever, and the slowly was not a performance and was not a choice. It was the simple physical consequence of receiving a force input that had exceeded the Kryptonian biology's design tolerance by a margin that the biology was working to determine the size of while simultaneously doing the work of getting upright again. He stood in the transit station concourse with the ceiling hole above him and the structural damage of the partial collapse around him and the dust still settling from the impact. And he took stock of himself with the internal sensory precision of someone who has spent years knowing exactly what his body was capable of, and can therefore detect with high accuracy the difference between his current state and baseline. What he found was not damage in the catastrophic sense. Nothing had failed. Nothing was broken in the structural way. The biology was intact, but something that was different from intact in a way that was harder to categorize precisely, like a system that had been run at a load beyond its rating and was now running at baseline but with a different sense of where the rating was. The rating felt revised, not lower exactly. Revised in the direction of the recognition that it had a ceiling and that the ceiling had been located. He floated up through the concourse ceiling hole and back to street level, which took longer than it should have because the flight response that was normally automatic was running through a small additional delay that was new and which he identified, with the honest self-assessment that years of being the most powerful thing in the room had not entirely eliminated, as the delay of a system that has just experienced something that made it temporarily uncertain of its own parameters. He emerged into the daylight of the cleared street and found Saitama standing where he had been, at the edge of the crater, looking at him with the expression that had been consistent since the beginning, mild, attentive, present, but with the additional quality of focus that had appeared when the strike had landed earlier. That quality was still there, and it had a texture that Superman was reading now with the attention he should have been paying from the first rooftop encounter, which was the attention of someone who has finally identified the right category to put something in and is looking at it properly for the first time. The quality was not satisfaction. It was not aggression or triumph or any of the things that beings who were capable of hitting as hard as Saitama had just hit usually felt when they produced that result in an opponent. It was closer to the expression of someone who had asked a question and received an answer that was the same answer they had been receiving for a long time from different sources. An answer they had been hopping would eventually be different, and which was once again the same. "You're pretty tough," Saitama said. It was the same sentence he had said about Thanos on a different battlefield in a different universe, delivered with the same tone, and it carried the same weight, not a compliment in the conventional sense, but an accurate assessment that contained within it the specific sadness of someone for whom accurate assessments had stopped being satisfying. Superman looked at him and then at the crater and then at the partial collapsed buildings and then at the research folder still sitting on the section of intact pavement where Saitama had set it before the punch, undisturbed, and he performed the final processing step of an update to his self-assessment that had been building since the rooftop. "You held back," he said. It was not a question. Saitama looked at him. "I always do," he said. "If I don't, things stop." He gestured vaguely at the crater, and the buildings with the gesture of someone indicating a mild excess that they'd rather not repeat. The regime's response to the street engagement arrived in stages that each told a different part of the story of what the punch had done to the institutional architecture that the regime had been running on. The first stage was the tactical response, regime enforcement units converging on the administrative district in response to the structural damage alerts, which was automated and had already been in motion from the moment the building's monitoring systems registered the collapse event. The second stage was the communications response, Wonder Woman receiving the real-time feed from the street surveillance system and watching the playback of the punch, and the transit station, Concourse and Superman's slow emergence, and standing with the feed playing on loop for approximately 90 seconds, while the separate mental file she had been maintaining completed itself in a way she had been approaching and could no longer defer. The third stage was the institutional response, which was slower and less visible than the first two and more significant than either of them, which was the response of the regime's entire operational apparatus to the information that Superman had been hit hard enough to go through a transit station and come up slowly, and the information was moving through the apparatus not through official channels, but through the informal channels that parallel the official ones, the aid-to-aid communications and the whisper networks. And what it was producing as it moved was a specific quality of systemic uncertainty that institutions develop when the foundational assumption their authority structure rests on has been publicly and visibly tested and found to have a limit. Batman received the surveillance feed through an Insurgency network tap on the administrative district's monitoring system 40 minutes after the event, and he watched it with the comprehensive attention he brought to everything and arrived at a tactical assessment that reorganized his planning in several significant ways simultaneously. The assessment started with the observable facts. Saitama had walked into a regime-secure facility, retrieved the research, walked out, received a Kryptonian strike, eaten a sandwich, delivered a single punch that had sent Superman through a transit station, and was still standing in the street with the research folder. The assessment moved through what the observable facts implied about capability, about the power differential that the punch established, about what that differential meant for the balance of force that the injustice world had been organized around since the consolidation. It arrived at a conclusion that was the most significant tactical conclusion the insurgency had reached in years of operating against overwhelming force disadvantage, which was that the force disadvantage had been resolved, and the resolution had not come from any plan the insurgency had executed or any capability it had developed. It had arrived by accident, in a yellow suit, looking for a grocery store. He opened a channel to the insurgency's regional cells and composed a communication that was careful and precise, and said less than it could have said because the operational security of saying less was more important than the completeness of saying more, and what it said was, "The strategic picture has changed. Stand by for updated operational directives." He sent the communication and then returned to the surveillance feed, watching Superman and Saitama on the cleared street, and he watched Superman make a decision that was visible in his posture before it was visible in his actions. The decision to not continue the engagement, to withdraw from the street, to return to the Hall of Justice and process what had happened before making another operational choice in the situation. It was the correct decision given the information Superman now had, and Batman watched him make it, and noted that it was correct, and noted also that correct decisions made from positions of newly understood limitation had a different quality than correct decisions made from positions of confidence, and the quality of limitation was now part of how Superman occupied his position in a way it hadn't been before. And position occupied with limitation was a different kind of position than position occupied without it. Saitama picked up the research folder from the section of intact pavement after Superman left, and looked at the street around him, the crater, the partial collapsed buildings, the cleared pavement, with the expression of someone surveying an outcome they had not intended and are deciding how they feel about it. He felt, specifically, the mixture of things he felt every time an encounter produced this kind of result, which was the mild satisfaction of having successfully retrieved what he needed mixed with the persistent background disappointment of having been in a situation that required a punch, and having delivered the punch, and having it produce the familiar outcome, which was that the thing punched was damaged but not ended, which was the outcome that the situations in his own universe had stopped producing after the training, and which the situations in other universes kept producing, because other universes calibrated their upper limits differently. He turned the research folder over in his hands and thought about home and about Gino's filing missing person reports and about the drafty window in his apartment, and he started walking in the direction of the lower district, because the lower district was where the insurgency's contact network was, and the contact network connected to Bruce, and Bruce connected to whatever the plan for the research was now that he had it, and the plan was the path to home, and home was the point. 3 blocks from the crater, a small child sitting on the steps of an intact building looked at him as he walked past. The child looked at the yellow suit and the white cape in the research folder and said, with the frank assessment of someone who has not yet learned to moderate their observations, "You have a hole in your cape." Saitama looked down at the cape, where the hole from the electrokinetic enforcer's discharge at the facility entrance was visible. "Yeah," he said, "I know." The child looked at the street behind him, where the distant sounds of regime response units converging on the engagement site were beginning to reach the block. "Did you fight Superman?" the child asked. Saitama thought about how to answer this accurately. "He hit me," he said, "and then I hit him back." The child processed this. "Who won?" Saitama thought about this too, with the honest consideration he brought to questions that deserved honest consideration. "Nobody wins," he said, and it was not a philosophical statement and was not intended as one. It was the factual account of how his encounters always ended, which was with him still standing and the other party also still standing, and the gap between what he could do and what anything in the world could survive remaining the same uncrossable distance it had always been. He walked on. The child watched him go. The Hall of Justice had a particular quality in the hours following the street engagement that Wonder Woman recognized from the early consolidation period, from the specific days when the shape of what the regime was going to be was still being negotiated between the people who had decided to build it, and the negotiation had produced the quality she was recognizing now, which was the quality of an institution that has been operating on a shared set of assumptions, discovering that the assumptions are not as shared as the operation had required them to appear. The consolidation period's version of this quality had resolved into the regime's current form, which meant the resolution had been towards Superman's position and away from the positions of the people who had argued for different constraints and different limits. And most of those people were now either insurgency members or were in positions where their continued participation in the regime required them to not argue for anything anymore. What made the current version of the quality different from the consolidation period's version was that the consolidation period's disagreements had been about principles and methods, and principles and methods were things that could be argued toward resolution through the application of sufficient authority. The current version was about something that authority couldn't argue with, because it was about what the punch had established as fact, and facts were not responsive to authority. Hal Jordan requested a private meeting with Wonder Woman 4 hours after the street engagement, which was a request she had been expecting, because Jordan was one of the people whose continued participation in the regime required him to not argue for anything anymore, but who had been accumulating arguments for a long time in the file he maintained behind his operational compliance. And the street engagement had added something to that file that made the file's weight harder to carry. He came to the meeting with the careful, measured delivery of someone who has prepared what they're going to say and has prepared it for honesty rather than strategy, which was one of the things about Jordan that made him simultaneously valuable and difficult. He said that the street engagement had confirmed what the force calculations had suggested since the first incident report, that the entity's capability existed in a category that the regime's entire framework of authority was not built to accommodate, and that the regime's response to the entity so far had not produced anything that changed this, and that the path the regime was currently on, which was attempting to manage the entity's departure timeline by controlling access to the dimensional displacement research, was a path that the street engagement had now demonstrated was not viable, because the entity had simply gone through the facility's security and taken the research and absorbed a Kryptonian punch and walked away. He paused after delivering this and looked at Wonder Woman with the expression of someone who has said the accurate thing and is now waiting for the response that accurate things receive in the regime, which was not always the response they deserved. "I know," Wonder Woman said. Jordan looked at her. "Then what are we doing?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, and the moment contained more than its duration suggested, because the question was not only about the situation with Saitama, and they both understood that. The meeting produced no decisions and several understandings, and the understandings were the more significant product, because decisions in the regime required Superman's involvement, and the understandings were the kind that existed in the space where people who had committed to an institution began the process of revising their commitment in the light of new information. And that process was quiet and slow, and produced nothing that was immediately visible, but which, once started, was not something that could be unstarted. Jordan left the meeting and returned to his operational duties with the expression of someone who has said something important and is now waiting to discover what it will eventually mean. Wonder Woman returned to the monitor room and looked at the surveillance footage of the street engagement again, the specific 17-second sequence from the punch's delivery to Superman's emergence from the concourse, and she watched it with the full attention it deserved, which was the attention she had been giving it since it first arrived, and which had been producing the conclusion she had been building toward since the first incident report. and which was now complete enough to constitute a position, rather than a preliminary assessment. The position was this: the regime's authority had been constructed on the premise that Superman's physical supremacy was the ultimate expression of force in the world, and the entity's existence was not a challenge to that supremacy in the conventional sense of a challenge. It was not opposition, was not resistance, was not an alternative power structure asserting itself against the regimes. It was simply a demonstration that the premise was wrong, delivered without intent and without interest in the political implications of the demonstration, by someone who wanted to go home and had retrieved research toward that goal, and had responded to a Kryptonian punch with a punch of his own, and was now walking toward the lower district with a research folder. The political implications of the demonstration existed regardless of the demonstrators' intent, and they were significant, and they were already propagating through the regime's institutional structure via the whisper networks and the informal channels, and the propagation was producing the specific institutional response that significant accurate information produces in authority structures built on premises that the information contradicts, which was not collapse. Collapse was too fast and too clean for what was actually happening, but erosion, the slow and uneven process of foundational material being removed from beneath a structure that continues to stand, but is standing on less than it was. Superman was in the monitor room when Wonder Woman arrived, which was where she had expected him to be, because the monitor room was where he processed situations that required processing, and he was looking at the surveillance footage of the street engagement with the specific quality of attention she had been watching him apply to difficult things for years. She sat beside him and watched the footage with him and said nothing, because the situation had moved past the point where framing was useful and into the point where presence was more valuable than words, and she had learned in years of working alongside him that there were categories of moment where the most useful thing she could do was simply be there, providing the witness that the moment required without trying to shape what the witness produced in him. He watched the punch and the concourse and the slow emergence, and then he turned the footage off and looked at the main display, which showed the regime's operational map of Metropolis with the administrative district's damage assessment overlaid on it. And the damage assessment was a visual record of the 30-meter crater radius and the partial collapse buildings, and the transit station concourse ceiling hole. All of it produced by a single punch from a man who had then picked up a research folder and walked away. "How long has it been since something hit me like that?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Not since the early days," she said, "before the regime." He nodded, which was not agreement with a point but acknowledgement of a fact. He held back, he said. It was the third time the observation had been made, first by him on the street, then in his internal processing, and now here aloud in the monitor room, which was the third stage of his relationship with a piece of information, the stage where it moved from received to integrated. "Yes," she said. "I know," he said. He looked at the damage assessment for another moment. "What does the insurgency want with him?" Wonder Woman considered this. "The same thing we do," she said, "to understand what he is." He was quiet. "And what is he?" she answered with the honest precision that the situation required and that she had been building toward since the first incident report. "He's someone who wants to go home," she said. "Everything else is something we put on him because we don't have a category for someone whose only agenda is that simple." In the lower district, Bruce received Saitama's arrival at the secondary contact point with the research folder and the account of what had happened in the administrative district, and he processed the account with the thoroughness he applied to everything, and then sat for a long time with the thing the account confirmed, which was that the punch had happened and had produced the result it had produced, and that the result was now a fact in the world that every subsequent calculation had to account for. He had been running the insurgency for years on the foundational operational principle that the force differential between his side and the regime was a fixed parameter that strategy had to work around rather than through, and the fixed parameter had just been revised by a single punch from someone who was trying to get home. He thought about what the revision meant for the insurgency's operational options, and he thought about what it meant for the regime, and he thought about the fact that Saitama had no interest in the insurgency's cause, and was sitting across the safe house table from him looking at the research folder with the concentrated attention of someone trying to determine whether the thing they've acquired is actually what they needed. "Is this enough?" Saitama asked, meaning the research. Bruce looked at the folder. "I need to analyze it," he said, "but it should be." Saitama nodded and looked at the table and then at Bruce with the direct, practical gaze that was the closest he came to a searching look. "The guy in the blue suit," he said, "he's not going to stop." Bruce looked at him. "No," he said, "he won't." Saitama thought about this. "Does he need to be stopped?" He asked, and it was a genuine question rather than a rhetorical one. The question of someone who was trying to understand whether the thing standing between him and home was something he needed to address or something he could navigate around. Bruce considered the question for a long time, because it was the question that had been at the center of the insurgency's entire existence, and which had never been answered in a way that fully satisfied him. And the fact that it was being asked now, in this context, by someone who could answer it with a single punch if the answer was yes, made the consideration of it feel different than it had before. The regime's Watchtower orbital platform received an alert from the Metropolis Administrative District Sensor Network at this moment. Not about Saitama, whose sensor invisibility continued to make him undetectable in the conventional sense, but about a pattern of secondary indicators that the Watchtower's analytical system had been configured to recognize as correlates of the entity's presence, based on the regime's accumulated data from every interaction so far. The pattern was present in the lower district, which confirmed what the regime already knew. The entity was with the insurgency, which meant the insurgency had the research, which meant the insurgency was going to attempt to use the research, which meant whatever the research enabled needed to either be understood or prevented before it could be enabled. The alert was flagged to Superman's personal channel with the priority level that the regime system assigned to time-sensitive operational developments, and Superman read it in the monitor room and looked at Wonder Woman, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the operational implication was clear and required no elaboration, and they were both taking the moment they needed before it was acted on, because some actions, once taken, cannot be retaken. And they were both aware of which category this one was in. Bruce had the research analyzed within 6 hours of receiving it, which was faster than the complexity of the material suggested was possible, but which reflected the specific combination of the insurgency's best available physics expertise, and the fact that the regime's archive had, in its systematic centralization of pre-consolidation research, done the intellectual work of compiling and cross-referencing the theoretical materials in a way that made the analytical task significantly more tractable than starting from dispersed sources. The analyst who worked through the material was a former SDAR Labs researcher named Vasquez, who had been with the insurgency for 2 years, and who brought to the dimensional displacement problem the specific combination of theoretical grounding and practical improvisation that working under regime-era resource constraints produced in scientists who were serious about their work. She delivered her findings to Bruce in the safe house with the precise, economical delivery of someone who has learned to communicate complex information to a non-specialist without losing the complexity. And what she told him was that the displacement mechanism was reconstructible from the archived materials, that the reconstruction would require equipment that the insurgency could access through its network within 48 hours, and that the execution of the mechanism would require a specific energy input that she could specify exactly, and that was within the range of what the insurgency's available power sources could provide, with one qualification. The qualification was that the displacement needed to happen from a location with minimal electromagnetic interference from regime monitoring infrastructure. because the mechanism was sensitive to the specific frequency ranges that the monitoring architecture operated on, and the lower district sensor saturation was in exactly the wrong part of the spectrum. Bruce looked at the qualification and looked at the operational map and identified the location that met the electromagnetic requirement, which was a pre-consolidation industrial facility in Metropolis's eastern fringe, that the regime's monitoring architecture had gaps around because the facility's own equipment created interference that made the coverage impractical to maintain at full density. He had known about the facility for years. It was in the Insurgency's operational geography as a secondary asset, useful for exactly the category of activity that required reduced sensor coverage. And he had never used it for anything that would bring the full weight of regime attention to it, because it was too valuable as a persistent resource to spend on a single operation. He looked at the gap in the coverage map, and at the 48-hour timeline, and at the current state of the regime's institutional architecture, which the street engagement had begun eroding in ways that he was tracking through the Whisper network, data his cells were feeding him. And he made the assessment that the 48-hour window was narrower than it appeared, because the regime's erosion was producing in Superman exactly the kind of pressure that historically caused him to move toward consolidating control rather than away from it. And consolidating control in the current situation meant addressing the Saitama situation with more force rather than less. And more force in this context was a thing that Bruce needed to have already navigated before it arrived. He told Saitama about the plan that evening, in the safe house with Daniel and 2 Insurgency operatives present, and he delivered it with the same directness he had been using since the monitor introduction, because directness was what the situation required and what Saitama responded to. 48 hours, the Eastern Fringe facility, the equipment that was already being sourced through the network, and the energy input that would open the displacement mechanism and send him back to City Z. Saitama listened to this with the focused attention he brought to things that were directly relevant to what he wanted. And when Bruce finished, he asked the one question that the plan required him to answer for himself, which was whether 48 hours was safe to wait given what had happened in the administrative district and the pressure it had created on the regime's response architecture. Bruce told him honestly that it was not certain, that the regime would likely attempt to move against the situation before 48 hours had elapsed, and that the Insurgency's ability to manage that attempt was limited given the saturation coverage and the operational assets the regime could deploy. Saitama thought about this. So something might try to stop it, he said. Yes, Bruce said. Then I'll handle that, Saitama said, with the same practical simplicity he applied to everything, and Bruce looked at him and made the decision not to elaborate on the scope of what something might try to stop it meant, because the elaboration would take longer than the decision to trust the statement at face value, and the statement at face value was sufficient. The 48 hours began. The equipment was sourced through the network and moved to the Eastern Fringe facility through the Insurgency's logistics channels, arriving in stages over the first 36 hours with the careful, distributed movement that the regime's coverage gaps required. Vasquez worked at the facility while the equipment arrived, preparing the installation with the focused, methodical precision of a scientist who has identified a problem she can solve and is solving it, and the work progressed at the rate the analysis had projected. Bruce managed the Insurgency's operational posture during the same period, pulling assets from secondary deployments to strengthen the Eastern Fringe facility's perimeter awareness, not to stop whatever came. The Insurgency's physical capability against a full regime response was not a resource Bruce had any illusion about, but to provide enough advance warning that the final assembly work could be completed before contact was made. Saitama spent the 48 hours in the facility's large open-floor space, which he used for the training routine he had maintained since the beginning, not because the training did anything for him anymore, But because the routine was structure and structure was continuity and continuity was what connected the person he was here to the person he was at home, and home was what he was waiting for. Superman came at hour 39. He came alone, which was the decision Wonder Woman had argued against and which he had made anyway, because he had thought about Bruce's question. Does he need to be stopped? In the way that he thought about things that required him to examine the gap between what he wanted to be true and what was true. And the examination had produced something that was not quite a decision and not quite a concession, but was in the territory between them. And arriving alone was the expression of that territory. He came to the Eastern Fringe facility with the knowledge of its location that the Watchtower's correlation analysis had produced, and he came without regime enforcement backup, and he came 2 hours before Vasquez's assembly would be complete, and he stood in the facility's large open floor space across from Saitama, who was finishing the last of his morning training routine with the same focused, methodical precision that Vasquez was applying to the dimensional displacement assembly in the adjacent section of the facility, and he looked at the assembly equipment visible through the partition and at Saitama, and at the 39 hours of processing he had done since the street, and delivered it in the form of a conversation rather than a confrontation. "You're leaving," he said. It was an observation rather than a challenge, which was itself information about what the 39 hours had produced. "Trying to," Saitama said. "When it's ready." Superman looked at the assembly equipment. "The research you took from the facility," he said. "It's being used to send you home." "That's what Bruce said," Saitama confirmed. Superman was quiet for a moment, and then asked the question that the 39 hours had built toward, the one that required the most from him to ask, because it required acknowledging the premise that the regime's entire architecture had been built to make unnecessary. "Were we wrong to try to keep it from you?" he asked. Saitama looked at him with the mild, honest attention he brought to questions that deserved honest consideration. "You wanted something I needed," he said. "That's usually what fighting is." He paused. "I just wanted to go home." Superman looked at him for a long moment. "I know," he said, and the two words had a weight that came from somewhere deeper than the operational picture, from the specific place in him where he kept the things that the regime had required him to stop allowing to direct his decisions, and which had not been entirely silent even in the years when he had been most committed to what the regime required of him. Wonder Woman arrived 40 minutes after Superman, which was not part of any coordination, but was the product of her own tracking of the Watchtower correlation data, and her own assessment of what Superman going alone meant, and her own decision that the situation required her presence regardless of what that presence produced. She arrived in time to find Superman and Saitama in the open floor space in what was not a confrontation, was not a standoff, was not a negotiation, was not any of the configurations that an encounter between the regime's primary asset and an entity of confirmed extraordinary capability in a contested space should have been, but was two people occupying the same space without agenda, which was its own kind of significant in a world where every significant encounter had been defined by agenda since the consolidation began. She looked at it and added it to the mental file that was now complete enough to have become something else, something that was no longer a file of accumulated observations, but a fully formed position about what needed to happen next in the world she had been helping to run. And the position had nothing to do with Saitama and everything to do with what his presence had revealed about the world. Batman arrived via the facility's secondary access at hour 41, which was the hour at which the Insurgency's perimeter warning network reported the regime's main response force assembling at the facility's primary approach, and his arrival was operational rather than philosophical. He had come because the 48-hour window was going to be compressed by 9 hours, and the assembly needed to be accelerated or protected or both. And because the situation had developed in the hour 39 hours of the window into something that his operational assessment of the morning had not predicted, which was Superman and Wonder Woman present at the facility without their response force, which was itself information that required rapid integration into the current planning. He looked at Superman across the open floor space, and Superman looked at him, and they had the specific exchange that they had been having for years, which was the exchange of two people who had known each other before the world changed and who carried the before-world knowledge into every after-world interaction whether they intended to or not. "The response force is at the primary approach," Bruce said, "to the room in general. 2 hours out from this position." Superman said, "I know." Bruce looked at him. "Are you going to call them off?" Superman was quiet for a long moment, the kind of long moment that contained a decision being finalized rather than a decision being made, because the decision had been building since hour 39. "Yes," he said. The response force received the stand-down order 11 minutes later and began its withdrawal, and the regime's monitoring architecture registered the stand-down as an authorized operational decision and logged it without flag or inquiry, because the regime's monitoring architecture had been built to record decisions rather than to question them, and questions were not what the moment required. In the facility's assembly section, Vasquez looked up from her work at the sound of the communications exchange and then returned to the assembly, because the assembly had 9 hours left and the 9 hours were what mattered. The displacement mechanism activated at hour 47, which was 1 hour ahead of Vasquez's original timeline, because the final assembly stage had moved faster than projected once the response force stand-down had removed the operational tension from the facility's working environment, and everyone present had been able to apply their full attention to the task, rather than splitting it between the task and the monitoring of the situation's threat parameters. The activation produced a phenomenon that none of the people in the facility had a precise reference point for: a circular aperture in the air of the open floor space, approximately 2 meters in diameter, with the specific visual quality of a boundary between states rather than a hole in anything, the place where this universe's physical parameters ended and something else began. It held at a steady size and did not expand or contract, which Vasquez had predicted, and which indicated a stable displacement event rather than a collapsing or widening one. And the stability was the result that the research had been predicting since the analysis began, and which she had nonetheless been not entirely certain of until the aperture appeared and stayed. Saitama stood in front of it and looked at it for a moment. He looked at it the way he had looked at the Coruscant cityscape from the viewport, and the way he had looked at the Infinity Gauntlet stones, and the way he looked at everything that was genuinely, simply impressive without requiring any framework to appreciate, with the mild, present attention of someone who finds the thing in front of them interesting in a way that is real rather than performed. He looked at the aperture, and then he looked at the people in the room, going through them in the deliberate way of someone who has decided that this moment warrants acknowledgement even though acknowledgement was not his natural register. He looked at Vasquez, who was watching the aperture stability readouts with the focused satisfaction of a scientist whose prediction has been confirmed. He looked at Daniel, who had been at every significant point of his time in this world, beginning with the convenience store message, and who was standing near the secondary access with the expression of someone who has participated in something they will spend a long time thinking about afterward. He looked at the 2 Insurgency operatives, whose names he had learned over the 48 hours of the facility's operation. He looked at Bruce, who was standing apart from the others in the way he stood apart from everything, watching the aperture and watching Saitama with the twin attention of someone managing the immediate situation and processing its long-term implications simultaneously. He looked at Superman and Wonder Woman, who were standing together near the facility's main wall and who had been present since the previous day's conversation, and who had stayed not because anyone had asked them to stay and not because they had a regime operational purpose for staying, but because they had both, independently and by different routes, arrived at the same conclusion about the significance of the moment and the appropriate response to significance, which was presence. Superman looked back at him with the expression that had been developing since the rooftop and which was now fully formed. Not defeat, not the specific diminished quality that losing produced, but something more complicated and more honest, the expression of someone who has had an assumption revised and is in the early stages of deciding what to build on the revised foundation. Wonder Woman looked at him with the expression of someone who has completed a file that had been building for a long time and is now free of the weight of its incompleteness, which was not a lighter expression than the one that preceded it, but was a cleaner one. "Good luck with the guy in the blue suit," Saitama said to Bruce. Bruce looked at him for a moment and then said, "We'll manage." Saitama nodded with the accepting acknowledgement of someone who takes a statement at face value and finds it sufficient. He looked at Superman one more time. "You're pretty tough," he said, which was the same thing he had said on the street after the punch, and it carried the same weight it had carried then. The accurate assessment that contained within it the specific texture of a conclusion that had been reached honestly rather than constructed for effect. Superman received it with a quality of stillness that was different from the authority-projecting stillness of the regime and different from the controlled processing stillness of the rooftop, and was instead the stillness of someone who has heard something true said simply and is letting the simplicity of it do its work without trying to complicate it. "You too," he said, and it was the first time he had said anything to Saitama that operated purely on Saitama's terms rather than on the regime's, and the two words were small and were the most honest thing he had said in the facility and possibly for a long time before it. Saitama stepped through the aperture. The displacement event produced a pressure differential that moved through the facility's air as a single sustained breath outward from the aperture's position, and then the aperture closed, and the open floor space was empty of the one thing it had contained that had made it significant, and the significance did not leave with the thing that had carried it, but remained in the room in the way that significance always remains after the thing that produced it has gone. Sitting in the air and in the people who had been there, and in the decisions that were going to come from being there, which were different decisions than they would have been in the absence of the experience that had produced them. The world that existed after the aperture closed was not the world that had existed before Saitama arrived in it, and the differences were not the differences that the regime's operational language was equipped to describe, because the regime's operational language was built for differences that could be classified as gains or losses, advances or setbacks, and the differences that Saitama had produced did not sort cleanly into either category. The regime still existed. Superman still held the authority structure he had built since the consolidation, still occupied the position at the top of the power hierarchy that the regime had organized itself around. The Insurgency still operated from its network of safe houses and cell structures and secondary facilities, still pursued the strategic reversal of the consolidation through the accumulating pressure of sustained operations. None of that had changed in the factual sense of things that exist either being present or being absent. What had changed was the texture of the authority. The regime's authority had been built on Superman's power, and Superman's power had been built on the premise of its own supremacy, and the premise had been publicly and permanently revised by a punch in a Metropolis street, and the slow emergence from a transit station concourse that the surveillance footage had recorded, and which the regime's whisper network had distributed through every layer of the institution's informal information system. The revision did not destroy the authority. Authority built over years on the consistent application of overwhelming force does not dissolve because its foundational premise has been found to have a limit. But it changed the foundation's character, and changed foundations produce changed structures over time, even when the structures appear identical in the immediate aftermath. And the regime's structure was going to change, and the change had Saitama's departure from it as its proximate cause, even though he had not intended to cause anything, and had been thinking about getting home rather than about causes and their effects. Superman made two decisions in the 24 hours after the aperture closed, and both decisions were decisions he had been approaching since hour 39 of the 48-hour window, and the approach had been the approach of someone revising a foundational premise and seeing what the revision implied for the structures built on it. The first decision was to release the dimensional displacement research back to general archive access, removing the regime's control classification and making it available through the Republic's standard scientific information systems. The decision cost the regime a strategic asset and cost Superman a management mechanism that the facility seizure had established, and he made it because the assessment he had completed in the facility's open floor space had concluded that the mechanism's existence was inconsistent with the revised foundation, and inconsistencies between foundation and structure were, in his experience, better addressed directly than allowed to persist. The second decision was a conversation with Wonder Woman about the regime's structural review process, a process that had been proposed in the consolidation period and had never been initiated, and the conversation ended with an agreement to initiate it, and the initiation was not a concession and was not a dismantling. It was the beginning of a process that would take years and would not produce a clean resolution and would require sustained engagement with the question of what the regime had been right about and what it had been wrong about. And beginning, it was the most honest thing Superman had done since the world changed. Bruce received the news of the research declassification through the Insurgency's monitoring of regime administrative communications within 6 hours of the decision, and he read the declassification notice with the careful, comprehensive attention he brought to all regime administrative communications, and then he read it again. And then he sat with what it meant for the Insurgency's operational picture, and what it meant for the larger situation, and what it meant about the 39 hours that Superman had spent in the facility, and the conversation they had had in the open floor space, and the stand-down order that had been issued to the response force. And he arrived at a picture that was not simple, and was not complete, and was significantly different from the picture he had been working from before the aperture opened. He did not change the Insurgency's operational posture based on the picture, because operational posture required certainty that a single declassification notice did not provide, and Bruce Wayne had survived 3 years of regime operations by not converting incomplete pictures into premature operational changes. But he noted the picture and what it suggested and filed it with the precision of someone who has learned that significant information is best kept close and processed slowly, because slow processing of significant information was how you avoided the errors that fast processing of significant information produced. In City Z, in a small apartment with a drafty window, Saitama woke up on his floor with the disoriented feeling of someone who had been somewhere and was now somewhere else, and he lay there for a moment taking inventory of the familiar, the walls, the window, the mail that had accumulated on the counter, the grocery flyer from a sale that had been over for what felt like a long time but was probably not that long in the actual calendar of this city, which had continued its schedule indifferently while he was somewhere else. He sat up and looked at his hands and thought about a Metropolis street and a transit station concourse, and a man in a blue suit who had been pretty tough, and had said something honest at the end of it. And he thought about these things with the mild, retrospective attention of someone sorting through an experience to determine what it had been. And what it had been was interesting in the specific way that experiences are interesting when they produce something genuine in the people involved in them. He stood up and stretched and went to the window and looked at City Z, which was exactly what it had always been, and felt the specific mixture of things he always felt when he looked at it: the mild comfort of the familiar, the persistent background awareness of the gap that the training had created between him and the world it had prepared him for, the question that had no answer. He put on his tracksuit. He went to find something to eat. The injustice world behind him was already in the slow, uneven, contested process of becoming something different from what it had been, and it would take years and would not be clean and would not produce a simple outcome. And Saitama didn't know any of that and wouldn't have found it particularly interesting if he had. He found a convenience store that was open and bought instant noodles and walked back through the city's evening with the noodles under his arm, thinking about the sale that had started this and the groceries he still needed, and the drafty window he had been meaning to fix. And none of these thoughts were large, and none of them were small, and all of them were his, which was its own kind of thing. The injustice world would never return to what it had been, and he was thinking about noodles.